Hello, students and lifelong learners. Sorry to inform you, but you're not as rational as you'd like to think. Of course, me telling you this will be dismissed since it contradicts with your beliefs about yourself. You'll call to mind times when you're clearly rational, though of course, the very reasons why you're not that rational are the same reasons you would resist being told that. I'm not sure how much further we can get here, so I guess this is the end of the video. Please subscribe.
Oh, you're still here. Well, those of you who remain must at least be curious why you're not that rational. Congratulations, you've just taken the first step to becoming more rational by being open to learn how rational we're not. You're confused? Let's talk about it. The mind may be conceptualized as having two kinds of thought, what we'll call type 1 thinking and type 2 thinking. Type 1 thinking is the fast thinking part of our minds. It relies on intuition and tends to employ little mental effort in arriving at decisions. Type 2 thinking, on the other hand, is slower, more methodical, but requires greater mental effort. Whereas type 1 is willing to sacrifice accuracy for speed, Type 2 aims at accuracy over speed. We all have both kinds of thinking, but Type 1 tends to be more dominant, especially so and during times of stress. Type 2 thinking needs to be cultivated by education, and even then, we need to constantly remind ourselves to use it. Type 1 thinking, because it acts fast and intuitively, is a major reason for cognitive biases in the mind. Heuristics are an example of this. Heuristics are shortcuts that allow us to make quick judgments or decisions without having to spend too much effort and time. However, heuristics make us highly prone to arriving at incorrect conclusions. One example of this is the availability heuristic. Here, the mind tends to overestimate how often or likely some outcomes are based on how readily examples come to mind. The ease of retrieval is confused with the correctness of that information, and is one of the reasons our minds are susceptible to false facts. If you simply repeat that this is the best economy we've ever seen, or that immigration is a major issue, or that there's voter fraud, and especially if you provide vivid, emotionally laden examples, these tend to stick in the mind and be readily available for retrieval. Some watch various crime shows and tend to feel that criminal behavior is more frequent than it really is. The media's tendency to cover the unique, unusual, and sensational stories leads to an overestimate of the likelihood of certain events such as airline accidents or rare diseases. On the other hand, if examples don't come to mind readily, we might think that these situations are unlikely or rare. In the representative heuristic, we take a small sample of data and wrongly generalize it to a much larger situation. Cognitively speaking, it can be conceptualized as mistaking exemplars as prototypical for a given category. We do this when we rely on personal experience to decide what is true and false. Employers may decide to hire someone based on an interview, assuming that a small sample of information, the interview, is representative of a broader pattern, job performance. This is used by politicians whenever they say something like, "I know a person who." Case studies, personal examples, and anecdotes, while interesting and suggestive, don't amount to truth that's generalizable. Here, the representative heuristic is compounded by the tendency to see illusory correlations, which are when two unrelated variables happening at the same time are thought to influence each other. This happens with vaccines, say, for example, when a kid has been diagnosed with autism not too long after receiving their immunization shots, and the parent might come to connect the two, when in fact there is no relationship. Another problematic use of the representative heuristic happens when you have a friend of a different racial background, and this leads you to erroneously think that you have some special insight into members of that group as a whole. We all have to be vigilant against the kind of thinking that comes with heuristics. It's very prevalent in society, and it undermines medicine, politics, and many other areas. A variation of the representative heuristic is the gambler's fallacy. If the roulette table lands on black 5 times in a row, we might be inclined to think that it's more likely to land on red next time, that it can't possibly land on black 6 times in a row. In other words, we feel that a particular outcome is more or less likely to happen because of what came before and our beliefs about what is a typical outcome in such a situation. However, the outcome of several rounds of roulette or the throw of the die die has no bearing on what the next round or throw will be. Another and related thinking error associated with these heuristics is base rate neglect. This is where we fail to take into account the general probability of something. This happens when we hear some new chemical in a food or other product increases cancer by 20%. This sounds scary until you realize that it's not an increase of 20% across the entire population, but of a much smaller subset. To explain this better, let's go through an example of the base rate fallacy when it comes to false positive paradoxes. Let's say that disease X occurs in 1 out of 1,000 people. We have a very effective test to detect this disease with only a 1% false positive rate. So let's do the math here. This means that in 1,000 people tested, you'll have approximately 1 individual test positive who truly has the condition. But we'll also have 10 individuals, or 1% of 1,000, who test positive but don't have the condition. In other words, a positive test is more likely to be a false positive than a true positive. Base rate neglect happens often in clinical psychology as well. Let's say you have someone whose primary presenting symptom is concentration difficulties. You may think, oh, this must be ADHD. But let's wait 1 minute here. Concentration problems are also found in depression and anxiety. Depression and anxiety are also more common than ADHD. If even a small percentage of people with depression and anxiety present with attention problems as the primary symptom, it very well may be more likely that when someone comes into your office complaining of problems with attention and concentration, just purely out of base rates, you're more likely to be dealing with anxiety and depression than ADHD. Of course, you need to do a full assessment to know for sure, but the point here is not to jump to conclusions just because a person is presenting with a symptom that's more prototypical of one condition than another. Another common thinking error is called confirmation bias. This is where one is highly resistant to consider information that's contradictory to one's beliefs. The mind is generally inclined to seek confirming rather than disconfirming evidence. It also tends to be more alert and responsive to evidence that supports pre-existing notions and beliefs than to evidence that challenges them. Nowadays, we see this greatly magnified through social media bubbles, where we're exposed only to information that we have liked and approved of while being able to escape from opposing views. This contributes to the spread of fake news. And even when we're confronted with unavoidable evidence that our beliefs are wrong, we will often not change our minds. This is called belief persistence. It's one of the reasons why fact-checking misinformation is not often very effective in stopping the misinformation from having its intended effect. Finally, I'll mention framing effects. This is where decisions are determined by the way information is presented. We see this, for example, when 62% disagree with allowing public condemnation of democracy, but only 46% agree it was right to forbid public condemnation of democracy. Economic policies receive greater support when the employment rate is highlighted rather than the unemployment rate. In one study, participants were presented with a hypothetical description of 2 parents in a child custody case. One parent was described with neither notably positive or negative traits, while the other was presented as having some salient positive and negative traits. When asked who would they award custody to, most chose the parent with positive and negative traits. But if asked who they would take custody away from, they were also more likely to indicate the parent with positive and negative traits. The reason being is that the participant with both positive and negative traits provided more clearly identifiable justifications for the participant's decision either way. If the question was framed in terms of who to reward custody to, participants could focus on the positive traits and justify their decision that way. But if framed in terms of who to take custody away from, participants focus on the negative traits to justify their decision. Framing effects work by biasing attention to focus on some information while ignoring other information.